My mother laughed loudly across the crystal dining table, declaring I would never own a home like my sister and her perfect husband. My sister smirked, asking if my jealousy was keeping me awake at night. I just smiled, sipping my wine, because they had no idea the mansion they were bragging about already belonged to me. A week later, I invited her over for tea at my new property. The second she walked through the double mahogany doors, she pulled out her phone, screaming for our mother to get there immediately. Before I reveal the secret that tore my toxic family apart, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that underestimated your worth. Dinner at my parents' house in Atlanta was always less about sharing a meal and more about establishing the family hierarchy. I am Sloane, 32 years old, and apparently the official disappointment of the Carmichael bloodline. The dining room was suffocatingly formal. My mother Vivian had spent 3 days polishing the silver and arranging imported orchids just to impress my brother-in-law Trent. Trent sat at the right hand of my father Jerome, swirling a glass of scotch with the practiced ease of a man who believed his mere presence elevated our family status. He was white, 37 years old, and supposedly descended from old money. My mother worshipped him. My father treated him like royalty. And my older sister Monique wore him like a designer accessory. Monique flipped her perfect silk press over her shoulder and dropped a glossy real estate brochure right onto my plate, covering my untouched asparagus. She tapped her manicured acrylic nail against the cover. I saw this cute little apartment complex out in the suburbs, Sloane. They do not require a high credit score, and the rent is strictly baseline. It is definitely more your speed than that shoebox you are leasing downtown. You really need to stop throwing money away on rent. It makes the family look bad. My mother Vivian chimed in with a high-pitched laugh that grated against my ears. Oh, leave your sister alone, Monique. We cannot all marry into the country club elite. Some women just have to settle for the struggle. She reached across the table and topped off Trent's wine glass with an expensive vintage imported specifically for him. Vivian did not even offer the bottle to me, pushing a pitcher of tap water in my direction instead. Listen to your sister, Sloane. If you cannot secure a wealthy husband, you should at least secure a decent roof over your head. It is getting embarrassing explaining to my sorority sisters why my youngest daughter is still a renter, while Monique and Trent just closed on a $10 million estate in Heritage Hills. My father Jerome grunted his agreement. He reached over with the serving fork and placed the thickest, perfectly seared cut of ribeye onto Trent's plate, completely bypassing me. You need to take notes from your sister Sloane. Look at what they are building. Heritage Hills is an exclusive community. Trent here used his family connections to bypass the waiting list. That is how real business is done, not whatever fake hustle you are running from your laptop. Monique leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and giving me a look of pure condescension. She let out a soft, mocking sigh. You are just jealous, right? It is okay to admit it, Sloane. It has to be hard watching us upgrade to a mega mansion while you are still playing pretend entrepreneur. I looked down at the brochure she had thrown on my plate, and then up at the 3 people who shared my DNA and the man who had completely brainwashed them. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I had shed my last tear over this family years ago. I simply picked up my fork and moved the brochure aside. Jealousy is a strong word, Monique, I said, keeping my tone completely level. I prefer to think of it as observing, just like I observed how you managed to secure that down payment. Tell me, did Trent dip into his legendary trust fund, or did Mom and Dad have to liquidate another asset? My father slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the silverware rattle. Watch your tone with your sister. Trent is bringing real value to this family name. He is opening doors in circles we have been trying to access for decades. You should be grateful he even sits at the same table as you. I met my father's angry glare without flinching. Value. I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue slowly. Like the value of my college fund, the one you and Mom drained entirely to pay off Monique's credit card debt when she wanted to keep up appearances in her graduate program. You took $90,000 from my future so Monique could buy designer bags and pretend she was part of the elite. I had to drop out and work 3 jobs while you told the entire neighborhood I just lacked the discipline for higher education. My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had just uttered a profanity. How dare you bring up ancient history? We made a sacrifice for the family image. Monique needed to look the part to secure a man of Trent's caliber. And look at the return on investment. She gestured grandly toward Trent. They are moving into Heritage Hills. We are finally establishing a legacy. You just lack vision, Sloane. You always have. Trent offered a patronizing chuckle, adjusting the cashmere sweater draped casually over his shoulders. Now Vivian, let us not be too hard on Sloane. Not everyone understands how wealth preservation works. Sometimes the weaker branches have to be pruned to let the main tree thrive. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. If you are struggling with your rent next month, Sloane, let Monique know. I might be able to throw a few $100s your way. Think of it as a charitable donation. The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the air. This broke, fraudulent man, who had systematically drained my parents' retirement accounts under the guise of exclusive investments, was offering me charity. My parents beamed at his generosity, completely blind to the reality of the snake they had invited into their home. They were so desperate for proximity to whiteness and perceived generational wealth that they would gladly let Trent chop me into firewood to keep him warm. Monique checked her reflection in her phone screen, adjusting her lip gloss. Do not waste your money on her, babe. She will just waste it on her little side business. Seriously, Sloane? What is it you actually do again? Property management? House flipping? It is so hard to keep track of your little hobbies. I looked at my sister, taking in her desperate need to feel superior. She needed me to be a failure so her fabricated success could shine brighter. She built her entire identity around being the golden child, the one who elevated the family name by marrying a man who spoke with a mid-Atlantic accent and belonged to exclusive clubs. She had no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a private equity firm specializing in luxury real estate acquisitions. She had no idea that my little hobby managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And she certainly had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months aggressively buying up every single debt her beloved husband owed. I did not explode. I did not throw my drink in her face or scream about my achievements. Power does not need to shout. True power sits quietly and waits for the perfect moment to strike. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and smiled serenely at my sister. Actually, my business is doing quite well, I said, my voice smooth and unbothered. In fact, I am working on a major project right now. A very high-profile client hired me to stage their new estate for a massive portfolio reveal. It just so happens to be in Heritage Hills. Monique frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in confusion. Heritage Hills. They let people like you work in that neighborhood. They do. When you hold the keys, I replied, taking a slow sip of my wine. I will be at the property all next week, finalizing the details. You should come over for tea, Monique. Since you and Trent are moving to the neighborhood, it would be a great opportunity for you to see how the real owners live. Bring Mom and Dad, too. I would love to give you all a personal tour of the estate. My mother rolled her eyes. Staging someone else's house is nothing to brag about, Sloane. But I suppose it will be nice for you to see what a real mansion looks like inside. We will stop by. Just make sure you use the service entrance when you are working. I smiled wider, feeling a genuine thrill of anticipation coursing through my veins. Oh, do not worry, Mom. I will be greeting you right at the front door. Under the cover of the heavy linen tablecloth, I pulled out my phone. I opened my secure email app and navigated to the draft I had prepared earlier that afternoon. The recipient was my lead attorney. The subject line read, Initiation of Foreclosure and Asset Seizure, Trent Blackwell. I stared at the screen for a fraction of a second, thinking of the stolen college fund, the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, and the disgusting display of favoritism I had endured my entire life. I pressed send. The email vanished into cyberspace, setting into motion a chain of legal actions that would completely annihilate Trent's fake empire and strip my family of the illusion they had sacrificed me to build. I placed my phone back in my lap and looked up at my family. They were laughing together, clinking their crystal glasses in a toast to Trent's supposed brilliance and Monique's fictional success. They looked so happy, so smug, so utterly convinced of their superiority. They had no idea that the countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. I participated in every extracurricular activity imaginable just to get a fraction of the praise my parents showered on my older sister Monique. But no matter how hard I worked, I was always the family disappointment, while she remained the untouchable golden child. That painful dynamic is exactly what brings me to the events of exactly 7 days after that suffocating family dinner. The dinner where my mother Vivian laughed in my face and told me I would never own a home like Monique and her husband Trent. They had mocked my fake hustle and bragged about their new mega mansion in Heritage Hills. They did not know I was the founder and chief executive officer of the private equity firm that actually owned that entire estate. Under the dinner table, I had quietly sent an email to my legal team initiating the immediate foreclosure and eviction of Trent's fraudulent shell company. He had not bought anything. He had rented it using my parents' stolen retirement funds, and he was already 3 months behind on payments. Now, exactly 1 week later, I stood in the grand foyer of that very same Heritage Hills estate, waiting for my sister to arrive. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive 30-foot floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, elegant shadows across the imported Italian marble floors. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored silk blouse, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp air conditioning that circulated through the 32,000-square-foot property. This was not just a house to me. It was a fortress of success that I had built from the ground up from the ashes of my ruined college fund and the remnants of my shattered self-esteem. My legal team had been quietly executing the strict orders I had sent. The sheer delusion of their lifestyle was almost laughable, but today, the laughing would finally come to an end. I had sent Monique a casual text message the day before, inviting her to visit a property I claimed I was merely staging for a wealthy client. Her response had been predictably condescending, agreeing to stop by just to see how the hired help worked. My estate manager William approached me with a silver tray, holding a delicate porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea. He was a distinguished older gentleman who had managed properties for actual billionaires for decades. He knew the difference between real wealth and the loud, desperate performance of money that my sister and her husband put on every day. "They are approaching the main gate," Madam CEO Williams said quietly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast entryway. "Security has cleared her vehicle for entry." I took a slow sip of the warm tea, letting the bergamot flavor ground me. "Thank you, William," I replied. "Please ensure the staff addresses me by my proper title when she walks through those doors. It is time she understands exactly whose world she is stepping into." William bowed slightly and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving me alone in the center of the grand foyer. Through the massive glass front doors, I watched a white Mercedes-Benz slither up the long, circular driveway. I knew for a fact the car was leased under my father's name because I had seen the financial records during my corporate takeover preparations. Monique stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a pair of oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a bright orange Birkin bag that I knew she had purchased on a credit card my parents were currently struggling to pay off. She paused in the driveway, looking up at the towering columns and the sweeping architecture of the estate. For a brief second, I saw genuine awe on her face, but it was quickly replaced by her signature mask of arrogant entitlement. She marched up the limestone steps, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone like weapons preparing for a battle she did not know she had already lost. Before she could even reach the brass handle, William opened the heavy double doors with practiced grace. "Good morning, Madam," William said, bowing his head politely. "Madam CEO is expecting you in the grand foyer." Monique paused mid-step, taking off her sunglasses to glare at the older man. "Madam CEO," she repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. "What kind of ridiculous title is my sister making you call her? Just point me to wherever she is pretending to work. I need to make sure she has not damaged any of the original fixtures in my new home." William did not react to her rudeness. He simply extended a white-gloved hand toward the center of the room, maintaining his perfect professional composure. Monique strutted past him, her eyes sweeping over the dual-curved staircases, the crystal chandelier that hung like frozen rain from the domed ceiling, and the intricate gold leaf detailing on the crown molding. She was so busy taking inventory of what she believed was her new kingdom that she did not immediately notice the centerpiece of the room. When she finally turned her head, her perfectly contoured face completely froze. Hanging proudly between the two sweeping staircases directly above the landing was a massive oil portrait. It was a beautiful piece commissioned by my board of directors last year to celebrate my firm crossing the billion-dollar valuation mark. It depicted me sitting in a leather wingback chair, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, looking directly forward with a calm, authoritative expression. Monique stood paralyzed in the center of the marble floor. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. She looked from the painting to the sweeping staircase, and then finally to me, standing quietly at the bottom of the steps with my teacup in hand. I watched her brain struggle to process the visual information. The cognitive dissonance was hitting her hard. She had spent her entire life believing I was the family failure, the quiet, awkward girl who rented a small apartment and did fake computer work to survive. Now she was standing in a house that looked like a modern palace, staring at a museum-quality portrait of the sister she despised. "What is this?" Monique finally managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "Why is there a giant picture of you hanging in my house? Sloan, you need to take that down right now before Trent gets here. He is going to be furious that you are treating our property like your own personal art gallery." I took another unhurried sip of my tea. The porcelain clinking softly against the saucer was the only sound in the room. "This is not your house, Monique," I said, my voice completely level. "And Trent is not going to be furious about the painting. He is going to be furious about the eviction notice that my lawyers just served to his shell company early this morning." Monique's face contorted with a mixture of confusion and sudden rising anger. She marched toward me, pointing a manicured finger in my face. "You are sick, you know that. You are completely delusional. Trent and I closed on this house a month ago. We have the paperwork. We have the keys. You are just a hired contractor here to stage the guest bedrooms. You need to pack up your little tea set and get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I shook my head slowly, letting out a soft sigh of pity. "You really do not pay attention to the documents you sign, do you, Monique? You never have. Not when Mom and Dad forged my signature to give you my college money, and certainly not when your husband handed you a stack of legal papers hidden inside a fake real estate portfolio. Trent never bought this house. He signed a short-term luxury lease under a fake corporate name to convince you and our parents that he was wealthy. But he ran out of money 3 months ago. He has been dodging calls from the property management firm ever since. And as of last week, my firm purchased the entire development." "That is a lie!" Monique screamed, the sound echoing harshly against the marble walls. "Trent comes from legacy wealth. His family practically owns half of the eastern seaboard. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me because I am the one Mom and Dad actually love. I am the one who married well. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely spinster trying to ruin my life." She was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving as the carefully constructed illusion of her life began to crack. To avoid facing the truth, she turned her anger toward her physical surroundings. She looked around frantically as if searching for something to validate her reality. Her eyes landed on a stunning hand-painted Ming Dynasty replica vase sitting on a pedestal near the entryway. Without a second thought, she lunged toward it, grabbing the heavy porcelain by its neck. "If you do not leave right now, I am going to start destroying everything you staged in here," she threatened, lifting the vase dangerously high. "I will tell the staging company you went crazy and smashed it yourself. They will ruin your fake little business and you will be back to working retail by the end of the week." I did not flinch. I did not move forward to stop her. I simply watched her with cold, detached fascination. "That vase belongs to my personal collection," I informed her quietly. "It is valued at roughly $45,000. If you drop it, I will simply add it to the mountain of debt your husband already owes my firm." The words "my firm" seemed to trigger a complete psychological break. With a guttural scream of pure rage, Monique hurled the vase onto the marble floor. The crash was deafening. Thousands of beautiful blue and white porcelain shards exploded across the pristine stone, scattering like the fragments of her fabricated life. I stared at the broken pieces and then looked back up at my sister. Her chest was heaving and her eyes were wild. She dug into her bright orange bag and pulled out her cell phone, her fingers shaking violently as she scrolled through her contacts. "I am calling Mom!" she shrieked, pressing the phone to her ear. "You have gone completely insane. You need to be committed to a psychiatric ward. You are trying to steal my house." The phone connected, and I could faintly hear my mother's voice on the other end asking what was wrong. "Mom, you need to get here right now," Monique cried out, her voice shifting instantly into the tone of a helpless victim. It was the same tone she used when we were children, the one that guaranteed my parents would punish me regardless of what had actually happened. "Sloan is here," she sobbed, pacing back and forth across the foyer, stepping on the broken porcelain without caring about her designer shoes. "She is squatting in the new house. She brought some weird painting of herself and she is telling these crazy lies about Trent. She is trying to steal my life again, Mom. She is trying to ruin my marriage because she is jealous. You need to get over here right now and make her leave before I lose my mind." I stood perfectly still watching a 35-year-old woman throw a temper tantrum in my foyer. It was a pathetic display, but it also brought a profound sense of closure. For years I had wondered if maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive or too demanding. Maybe my family really did have a reason to treat me like a burden. But seeing Monique completely unravel at the mere suggestion that she did not own something she had not worked for confirmed everything I needed to know. They were parasites feeding off the energy and resources of anyone they could manipulate. Monique pulled the phone away from her face and glared at me, tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving dark streaks of expensive mascara. "Mom and Dad are on their way," she threatened, her voice trembling with misplaced triumph. "They are bringing the police, Sloan. You are going to be arrested. They are finally going to see how deeply disturbed you really are. You are going away for a long time." I smiled gently, holding my teacup with both hands to feel the residual warmth. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the Earl Grey, allowing the silence in the room to stretch out and suffocate her. The estate manager, William, stepped silently out of the hallway, holding a silver dustpan and broom ready to sweep up the broken vase. I raised a single finger to stop him, signaling that the mess should remain exactly where it was. It was a perfect physical representation of what was about to happen to the family legacy they cared so much about. "Make sure you tell Dad to hurry," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that made Monique involuntarily step back. "And tell him to bring your precious husband with him. Tell Trent to drive as fast as he possibly can." I carefully placed my teacup onto the silver tray that William had left on a nearby console table, smoothing down the front of my silk blouse. "Because I have a very fascinating legal document sitting on my desk right now. It has Trent's signature on it. And once Dad sees what his perfect, wealthy son-in-law has actually been doing with his retirement funds, I highly doubt the police are going to be leaving this house with me in handcuffs." Monique's eyes widened in absolute terror as the final words hung in the air between us, heavy with the promise of total destruction. She slowly lowered the phone from her ear, her mouth slightly open as the realization finally began to sink in that the sister she had spent a lifetime walking all over was now the one holding all the cards. The trap had been perfectly set, and the rats were rushing straight into it. Monique lowered her phone slowly, her chest heaving as the reality of my words settled over her. Before she could respond, the heavy mahogany front doors burst open. My parents rushed in, panting and flushed, followed closely by Trent. He was wearing his signature pastel sweater draped carelessly over his shoulders, exuding the manufactured ease of a man who believed his presence commanded automatic respect. Directly behind them were two uniformed police officers, looking visibly annoyed by the sudden disruption. Trent pointed a finger at me, his voice booming with entitled authority. "Officers, arrest this woman immediately. She has broken into my property and is harassing my wife. This is blatant trespassing, and I want full charges pressed to the maximum extent of the law." My father Jerome stepped forward, his face a mask of furious indignation. "Sloan, what is the matter with you? You have humiliated this family for the last time. How dare you come into your sister's home and pull a stunt like this? We have tolerated your jealousy for years, but this is unhinged. You need psychological help." My mother, Vivian, hurried over to Monique, wrapping her arms around her trembling daughter. "Oh, my poor sweet girl," my mother cooed, shooting me a look of pure venom. "I am so sorry you have to deal with this on what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. I always knew your sister was bitter, but I never thought she would stoop to criminal behavior." I stood calmly near the base of the grand staircase, watching the chaotic performance unfold. The two police officers exchanged a weary glance before the older of the two stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "All right, folks, let us calm down," he said, his voice projecting a practiced calm. "Can everyone please provide identification and we can sort this out?" Trent scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "My identification. I am the homeowner officer. My name is Trenton Blackwell, and my family has been prominent in this city for 4 generations. You should be handcuffing the intruder, not questioning the victim." The officer maintained his professional demeanor, refusing to be baited by Trent's aggressive posturing. "Sir, I still need to see identification and proof of residence. We received a call about a disturbance, and we need to verify who belongs here." Trent huffed, reaching into his tailored slacks to retrieve a slim leather wallet. He tossed his driver's license onto the console table with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "I demand to speak with Chief Harrison," he stated loudly. "Our families are well acquainted, and he will not be pleased to hear how his officers are treating me." The second officer, a younger woman, stepped forward, her expression tightening at Trent's blatant attempt to leverage privilege. "Sir, Chief Harrison is currently on his way. He requested to handle this specific call personally due to the nature of the property." Trent's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, puffing out his chest. "Good. Finally, some competence. He will have this deranged woman removed immediately." I remained perfectly still, holding my ground as the heavy oak doors swung open once more. Chief Harrison walked into the foyer, a seasoned veteran with graying hair and an aura of quiet authority. He took in the scene, the shattered Ming vase on the floor, the flustered parents, the arrogant husband, and me standing quietly by the stairs. He ignored Trent's expectant look and walked directly toward me, extending a hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Carmichael," he said, his tone respectful and familiar. "I apologize for the disruption. We received an emergency call from this address, and I wanted to ensure everything was secure given your recent acquisition of the development." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that only occurs when a fundamental truth is suddenly and violently overturned. My parents stared at the police chief, their mouths hanging open in identical expressions of shock. Monique clutched my mother's arm, her knuckles turning white. Trent was the first to find his voice, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. "What are you talking about, Harrison? She does not own this development. I bought this house. I have the paperwork. You need to arrest her right now before I call my lawyers and have your badge." Chief Harrison turned to face Trent, his expression hardening into a stern, unyielding mask. "Mr. Blackwell, I strongly suggest you lower your voice. Mrs. Carmichael is the legal owner of this entire estate and the surrounding property. You are currently trespassing on her land." Trent let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That is a lie. That is a ridiculous lie. She is a fake. She stages houses for a living. I closed on this property a month ago. My family trust backed the purchase." I finally stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking against the marble floor. I reached into the portfolio resting on the console table and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy clip. I tossed them onto the table next to Trent's driver's license. "You did not buy anything, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. You signed a short-term luxury lease under a shell corporation called Blackwell Holdings, LLC. You paid the first month's rent and the security deposit using funds you liquidated from a high-risk investment account. And you have not paid a single dime since. My father stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he had been physically struck. What is she talking about, Trent? You told us you bought the house. You showed us the deed. Trent was sweating now, his confident posture collapsing in on itself. She is lying, Jerome. She forged those documents. She is trying to frame me because she is obsessed with my wealth. She is a psychotic, jealous woman. I picked up the top document from the stack and held it out for the police chief to inspect. This is the official eviction notice served to Blackwell Holdings, LLC at 8 a.m. this morning. The shell company is currently 90 days delinquent on rent. Furthermore, the original property management firm was acquired by my private equity group Carmichael Real Estate Acquisitions 2 weeks ago. I am the sole owner of this property, and Mr. Blackwell is currently squatting. Trent's face drained of all color as the heavy silence swallowed the grand foyer. The police chief stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on his duty belt as he looked from the forged deed on the marble table to the new stack of photographs I had just pulled from my leather portfolio. My father Jerome let out a sharp, breathless gasp, stepping away from his precious white son-in-law, as if Trent had suddenly caught fire. "What are those photographs?" "Sloane," my father demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and lingering authority. I spread the glossy images across the table, smoothing them out with deliberate slowness. I wanted them to feel every second of this destruction. "These are security captures from a private wealth management office downtown," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "They show Trent sitting across from a predatory lender last month, handing over the collateral documents for a $2 million commercial loan. A loan secured entirely by your manufacturing company, Dad." Trent stumbled backward, bumping into the grand staircase. "That is a lie," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead, ruining his carefully curated old money aesthetic. "She is doctoring photos. She is trying to frame me because she is jealous of Monique." But the desperation in his voice was undeniable. Monique grabbed his arm, her diamond rings flashing under the crystal chandelier. "Trent, what is she talking about? You told me your trust fund paid for everything. You told me we were untouchable." I let out a soft laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Oh, Monique, there is no trust fund. There never was a trust fund." I turned my attention fully to my parents, watching their desperate illusions crumble in real time. For the last 6 months, my forensic accounting team has been tracing every single transaction linked to Trent's name. Do you want to know what we found? We found a man drowning in a decade of bad investments and gambling debts, a man who realized that the easiest way to fund his fake lifestyle was to find a wealthy Black family so desperate for validation and proximity to white elite status that they would hand over their bank accounts without asking a single question. My mother, Vivian, shook her head violently, her perfect silk press shifting around her shoulders. "No," she whispered, clutching her chest. "No, Trent comes from the Blackwell family. His grandfather built half of the estates in this city. He showed us the investment portfolios, Sloane. He showed us the returns." "He showed you fake spreadsheets, Mom?" I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And because you were so blinded by his last name and the color of his skin, you believed him. You believed him when he said he needed you to co-sign those personal loans to bypass temporary liquidity issues. You believed him when he convinced you to transfer your entire retirement fund into his fake holding company under the guise of an exclusive high-yield investment opportunity." The room felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum. The elegant space around us, with its sweeping staircases and towering windows, suddenly seemed like a beautifully decorated cage, holding nothing but lies and financial ruin. My father lunged toward the table, grabbing the banking documents I had laid out next to the photographs. He scoured the pages, his eyes darting frantically across the highlighted numbers. His hands shook so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet space. "It is gone," he choked out. looking up at my mother with wide, terrified eyes. Vivian, the retirement accounts are completely empty. The emergency funds, the stock portfolios, the money we set aside for the country club dues, all of it has been completely drained. The reality of their situation was absolute and undeniable. They had spent their entire lives treating me like a financial burden, constantly complaining about the cost of my basic needs, while gleefully handing over their entire life savings to a charismatic fraud, simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of success. They had traded their future for the temporary privilege of bragging to their equally toxic friends about their wealthy white son-in-law. Monique let out a piercing scream that shattered the silence. She turned on Trent, hitting his chest with her fists, her long acrylic nails scratching at his expensive cashmere sweater. "You told me we were rich, you liar. You told me the yacht was yours. You told me the cars were paid off and that we would never have to worry about anything. Where is the money, Trent? Where is all the money?" Trent grabbed her wrists, pushing her away roughly. "Shut up, Monique," he snarled, his polished facade completely shattered, exposing the nasty cornered rat underneath. "You think keeping you in designer clothes is cheap. You think those country club memberships and those fake charity galas pay for themselves. Your parents practically begged me to manage their money so they could brag to their friends about their financial genius son-in-law. I just gave them the privilege of funding the lavish lifestyle you relentlessly demanded. You wanted to play rich, and I let you play rich." The absolute audacity of his statement hung in the air, toxic and heavy. He had stolen their life savings, and he was standing in my foyer blaming them for being gullible enough to trust him. The police chief pulled out his radio, stepping toward Trent with a stern, uncompromising expression. "Mr. Blackwell, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the women and keep your hands where I can see them. Forgery and wire fraud are serious federal offenses, and it looks like we have clear, undisputed evidence of both right here on this table." Trent raised his hands, backing up against the wall, his eyes darting toward the front door as if calculating his chances of outrunning the police officers stationed there. My father stood paralyzed, staring at the bank statements that represented 40 years of his hard work, completely erased by the man he had chosen over his own daughter. The financial ruin was absolute, but the psychological break that followed was even more devastating to witness. Instead of attacking Trent, instead of screaming at the man who had just destroyed their future and insulted them to their faces, my mother collapsed onto the marble floor. She fell to her knees, the fabric of her expensive dress pooling around her as she began to hyperventilate. I watched her, expecting her to mourn the loss of her security, or perhaps apologize for pushing me away to favor a fraud. I expected some level of accountability, or at least a moment of clarity. But my mother Vivian was entirely consumed by the sickness of respectability politics. Her brain could not process the betrayal, so it defaulted to protecting her social standing at all costs. "Sloane?" she cried out, crawling toward me on her knees, her hands reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. I stepped back quickly, avoiding her touch, repulsed by the sheer desperation in her eyes. "Sloane, you have to fix this," she begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup and leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. "You have to pay off his debt right now. You have to cover the loan before the bank finds out what he did." I stared down at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust wash over me. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had never once defended me, and watched her crumble into a pathetic heap of misplaced loyalties. "You want me to pay his debts?" I asked, my voice dangerously low, perfectly measured and utterly devoid of sympathy. "Yes," she sobbed, nodding frantically, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "If the community finds out about this, we will be completely ruined. The women at the church, the board members at the country club, the neighbors, they will all know we were conned. They will laugh at us, Sloane. They will know Monique's marriage is a sham and that we have nothing left. You are rich now. You own this entire estate and a private equity firm. You just showed us that you have power. You have more than enough money to make this go away quietly. You have to save your sister's marriage. You have to save the family reputation before it is too late." The sheer blatant favoritism of her request was breathtaking in its cruelty. She was kneeling on the floor of my mansion, the very mansion she had mocked me for supposedly staging just an hour ago, begging me to sacrifice my own hard-earned wealth to save the white man who had stolen from her. She cared more about what her judgmental friends would say at the next charity luncheon than the fact that she was entirely broke. She cared more about maintaining the illusion of Monique's perfect life than acknowledging the reality of my success and the depth of my pain. The police chief let out a low whistle of disbelief, shaking his head as he watched my mother grovel. The younger officer behind him crossed her arms, looking at my parents with a mixture of pity and intense disdain. Even Monique stopped crying long enough to look at me with desperate, hopeful eyes, her sense of entitlement temporarily overriding her shock. "Yes," Sloane Monique sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, completely forgetting her carefully curated elegance. "You owe us. We are your family. You cannot just let my husband go to prison and let everyone think I married a broke loser. You have to use your firm to bail him out. Dad can pay you back eventually when the business recovers. You have to do this for us." I looked at the three of them, the mother who had stolen my college fund to buy fake luxury goods, the sister who had ridiculed my struggles while parading around in stolen wealth, and the brother-in-law who had treated me like dirt while secretly draining my family's accounts. I searched my heart for a shred of empathy, a lingering sense of duty, or a desire to rescue them from the flames of their own making. I felt absolutely nothing for them. The last tiny tether of familial obligation snapped clean, leaving me completely and beautifully free. "I will not give you a single dime," I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the grand foyer, bouncing off the marble and crystal. "I will not pay off the predatory loan he took out in your name. I will not replace the retirement funds you willingly handed over to him because you were too arrogant to perform basic due diligence. And I will certainly not spend a fraction of a cent to save a reputation built entirely on lies and self-hatred. You wanted to be part of the elite so badly that you let a con artist bleed you dry while you smiled and thanked him for the privilege. You made your choices, and now you can live with the consequences." My mother wailed, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably against the cold stone floor. Monique shrieked, stomping her foot like a petulant child throwing a tantrum, screaming that I was a monster who enjoyed watching them suffer. But it was my father, Jerome, who finally reacted to the finality of my words. The denial and shock morphed instantly into a blind, raging fury. He stormed toward me, his face purple with anger, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "How dare you speak to your mother that way?" He roared, his voice booming with the old terrifying authority he used to control our house when I was a child. "You are a selfish, ungrateful brat. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us. You have the power to fix this family, and you are choosing to be vindictive and cruel. I am your father. I am the chairman of the family business, and I am telling you to clean up this mess right now. If you do not pay off that loan and get the police to drop this investigation, I will disown you. You will be cut off from this family forever. You will never step foot in my house again, and I will make sure everyone knows what a traitor you are." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground and looked the man who had belittled my entire existence straight in the eyes. He was trying to use the same old threats of isolation and rejection that used to keep me awake at night feeling worthless and alone. He thought the title of chairman still carried weight. He thought the family business was still a shield he could hide behind, a weapon he could use to force me into submission. I slowly reached into my portfolio one final time, my fingers sliding over the smooth surface of the most important legal document I had brought with me today. I pulled it out, holding the thick packet of papers between us. I tilted my head slightly, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. "Are you sure you are still the chairman?" "Dad?" I asked softly, watching the confusion slowly replace the anger in his eyes. "Because I reviewed the corporate bylaws very carefully before I made my next move." The confusion in my father's eyes slowly gave way to a deep, creeping dread. He took a stumbling step backward, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the pristine air in the grand foyer suddenly seemed too thin to breathe. "What are you talking about, Sloane?" he demanded, his voice losing its booming resonance, cracking slightly at the edges. "I am the founder of Carmichael Industries. I built that company with my bare hands. I hold the controlling interest. You are just talking in circles to confuse us. You are lying." I walked slowly back to the console table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the imported marble. The sound was sharp and precise, measuring the seconds of his downfall. "You were the majority shareholder, Dad," I corrected him, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Past tense is very important here." I picked up another heavy file from my leather portfolio, letting the weight of it rest in my hands. "Do you remember 6 months ago, when the company was suddenly facing a massive unexplained liquidity crisis? You could not figure out why the operational accounts were bleeding cash so rapidly. You blamed the economy. You blamed overseas supply chain issues. You blamed the changing market. You blamed everyone and everything except the man standing right next to you." I pointed directly at Trent, who was currently trying to shrink into the shadows of the staircase, while Chief Harrison watched his every single move. "Trent had convinced you to let his boutique consulting firm run a comprehensive audit on our supply chain." I continued, locking my eyes onto my father's pale face. "He used a lot of expensive Wall Street buzzwords that you did not entirely understand, but you nodded along because you wanted so desperately to be part of his world. He set up a dozen phantom vendor accounts and systematically siphoned over $4 million directly from the Carmichael Industries operating budget to fund his fake trust fund lifestyle. He bled your life work dry, and you were too busy bragging about his non-existent pedigree at the country club to even notice the money disappearing from your own ledgers." My father slowly turned his head to look at Trent, a look of absolute utter betrayal washing over his aging features. Trent refused to meet his eyes, staring stubbornly at the shattered blue and white porcelain scattered across the floor. "You lied to me," Jerome whispered, his voice sounding hollow and fragile. "You sat at my dinner table and you lied to me. You said those vendors were thoroughly vetted. You said you were streamlining our logistics and saving us money." Trent sneered, his upper lip curling into a nasty defensive snarl. His polished old money aesthetic had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate cornered con artist. "You were easy marks, Jerome," he muttered bitterly. "You and Vivian wanted to believe I was some untouchable financial genius so badly that you practically handed me the routing numbers. You never checked the invoices. You never verified the corporate addresses. It is not my fault you are a terrible, gullible businessman who cares more about appearances than basic accounting." With a sudden roar of rage, my father lunged at Trent, his hands reaching out to grab the collar of his ruined cashmere sweater. The younger police officer quickly stepped between them, shoving my father back with a firm hand against his chest. Jerome staggered, breathing heavily, his face a mask of pure devastation and public humiliation. I turned to my father, drawing his attention back to me, refusing to let him look away from the reality of his choices. "So when the company was on the absolute verge of total bankruptcy, you panicked," I said, guiding him through the timeline of his own destruction. "You were desperate to keep the failure a secret from Mom and Monique. You needed a quiet bailout to save face. You sought outside investment knowing that no traditional bank would touch a company hemorrhaging cash at that rate without asking uncomfortable questions." I stepped closer to him, watching the realization dawn in his eyes. "You found a private equity firm willing to inject enough capital to save the business and keep your doors open," I continued softly. "But they demanded 51% of the voting shares in return. They demanded total control. And you signed the papers because your ego could not handle the alternative." My father's eyes widened as the pieces finally snapped together in his mind. "The private equity firm?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "The anonymous investment group from New York." I nodded slowly, tapping my manicured nail against the stack of corporate acquisition documents. "Carmichael Real Estate Acquisitions. I said, letting the name resonate in the quiet foyer. The exact same firm that just bought this luxury housing development. The firm that I founded 5 years ago when you refused to help me pay for my education. The firm where I sit as the chief executive officer and majority owner. I bought 51% of your company, Dad. I own the family business. The silence in the foyer was absolute and suffocating. Even my mother had stopped sobbing, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You cannot do this," my father stammered, his hands shaking violently as he reached blindly for the documents on the table. "I am your father, Sloan. I built that company from a single warehouse. It is my blood and sweat. It is my legacy." "It was your legacy," I corrected him, my voice turning hard and unyielding as steel. "Until you let a charismatic parasite run it into the ground because he wore expensive sweaters and played golf at the right clubs. You completely neglected your fiduciary duties to the company. You failed to perform basic executive oversight. You facilitated massive corporate fraud by giving Trent unrestricted access to company funds without board approval or secondary authorization." I stepped right into his personal space, invading the invisible barrier he had always maintained between us. I forced him to look directly at the daughter he had always treated like an embarrassing disappointment. "As the majority shareholder of Carmichael Industries, I am officially convening an emergency executive action right here and now," I announced, my voice ringing clearly through the vast echoing space. "Jerome Carmichael, you are hereby terminated from your position as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. You are stripped of all corporate access, all company accounts, and all executive privileges. You are fired, Dad." He looked as though I had driven a physical blade straight through his ribs. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to issue another threat, but no words came out. The man who had spent his entire life dominating every room he entered, intimidating everyone around him, was suddenly rendered entirely speechless. He was stripped of the very title that gave his life meaning, reduced to nothing more than a foolish old man who had been outsmarted by the child he despised. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, scrambling up from the marble floor to grab my father's arm. "Jerome, tell her she cannot do this," Vivian shrieked violently, shaking his sleeve. "Tell her she is lying to us. We cannot lose the company. How will we pay for the country club memberships? How will we maintain the house? What will my friends say? Jerome, you have to say something to her. You have to make her stop." But Jerome had nothing left to say. His broad shoulders slumped, and he looked like a deflated balloon, a broken hollow shell of a man who had traded his actual family for a pathetic illusion of social status. He just stared at the floor, entirely broken. Chief Harrison stepped forward, breaking the tense tableau. He signaled to his younger officer with a tilt of his head. "Mr. Blackwell, I think it is time we take a ride down to the precinct. We have a lot of detailed paperwork to go over regarding these phantom vendor accounts, the forged loan documents, and the massive wire fraud you seem to have committed." Trent finally panicked, his cool facade completely shattering into pathetic desperation. He tried to pull away from the officer, struggling against the firm professional grip on his arm. "You cannot do this to me," he yelled, his voice cracking, pitching upward in fear. "Monique, tell them. Tell them I was just trying to provide the life you deserved. Tell them it was all for the family. You cannot let them take me to jail, Monique." I turned my gaze to my older sister, wondering how the golden child would react to the absolute destruction of her fairy tale. Monique did not look at him. She did not look at my parents. She looked down at the shattered pieces of the priceless Ming vase on the floor, and then she slowly looked around the massive, beautiful foyer of the mega mansion she would never own. The reality of her physical world was completely obliterated. She had no rich husband, she had no luxury real estate, she had no family wealth left to inherit, and no trust fund to fall back on. Everything she had built her arrogant identity upon was gone in a single hour. She stood frozen for a long moment, her perfect face blank and unreadable as her mind raced to find a way out of the wreckage. And then I watched her do what she always did when reality became too difficult or uncomfortable to handle. She retreated to the one place where she could still control the narrative, where the truth did not matter as long as the lighting was good. Monique slowly reached into her bright orange designer bag. her hands remarkably steady now. The panic seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a cold, calculated determination. She pulled out her smartphone and tapped the screen, her face completely devoid of genuine emotion. She smoothed her hair, pushed her shoulders back, and expertly manufactured a look of absolute, devastated innocence. She held the phone up in front of her face, angling it perfectly to capture the police officers restraining her struggling husband and my parents looking broken and ruined in the background. She pressed a button on the screen, and I knew instantly what she was doing. The little red live indicator lit up in the corner of her phone display. She had hundreds of thousands of followers online, an army of strangers who worshipped her fabricated lifestyle, who envied her fake wealth, and who hung on her every single word. "Guys," Monique said, her voice trembling with perfectly executed fake tears, her lower lip quivering just the right amount. "I am so sorry to go live like this, but I am so scared and I need help. My psycho sister has completely lost her mind and is attacking my family. She is stealing my family assets and trying to take my new house." She pointed the camera lens directly at me, a malicious, defiant gleam burning in her eyes. She absolutely refused to lose. If she could not have the wealth and the status, she would happily take the victimhood, and she would use her digital army to tear me apart. I stared directly into the lens of her camera, refusing to flinch, refusing to break character. The cool air conditioning of the foyer felt magnificent against my skin as I watched my sister attempt to weaponize her internet fame against ironclad legal reality. She was performing for an audience of ghosts, people who only knew the version of her that existed in carefully filtered photographs and sponsored posts. She kept the camera trained on me, her voice echoing off the domed ceiling. "Look at her," she cried softly, squeezing out a single perfect tear. "She brought the police here to ruin my life because she has always been jealous of me. She forged documents to steal my father's company. Someone please call for help." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my heels ringing out like a judge's gavel. The police chief did not intervene. He simply watched, recognizing the pathetic nature of her digital, desperate plea. My mother was still on the floor, weeping quietly into her hands, mourning her country club luncheons and her social standing, while her entire world collapsed. My father remained a statue of defeat, staring blankly at the eviction notice bearing Trent's fraudulent corporate name. Monique backed away slightly as I approached, keeping the phone held high. "Stay away from me, Sloane," she warned, her voice pitching for the benefit of her viewers. "I am broadcasting this to over 500,000 people. They are all watching you try to destroy us." I stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough to see the panic hiding just beneath the surface of her digital mask. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or fear. I simply tilted my head and gave her a small, knowing smile that I knew would translate perfectly through her high-definition lens. "Are you telling your followers the truth about the house, Monique?" I asked, my voice smooth and projecting clearly into her phone's microphone. "Are you telling them about the shell company your husband used to fake this luxury lease? Are you explaining to your audience that your entire lifestyle is funded by predatory loans and stolen retirement funds?" Monique's eyes darted nervously, but she kept the camera steady. "She is lying, you guys," she said to the screen, her voice shaking. "She is a pathological liar." I reached into my portfolio one last time and pulled out the thick stack of forensic accounting reports, the heavily redacted bank statements, and the signed confessions from the private equity takeover. I held them up, holding them steady so the camera could capture the official corporate seals and the undeniable signatures. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Carmichael Real Estate Acquisitions," I stated clearly, addressing her followers directly. "This estate belongs to my firm. Your husband, Trenton Blackwell, is currently 3 months delinquent on rent and is being actively investigated for wire fraud and forgery. The police are here to escort him off my property and take him into federal custody. I am not stealing your life, Monique. I am simply repossessing the assets you stole to build it." I watched the live comment stream on her phone screen begin to blur as thousands of confused and shocked viewers flooded the chat. The carefully curated illusion she had spent years building was unraveling live on the internet for everyone to see. The golden child was finally exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality, and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to hide. Chief Harrison cleared his throat, stepping forward to take control of the scene. "All right, that is enough broadcasting for today," he said firmly, reaching out to tap the screen of Monique's phone. "We have an active crime scene here, and I need everyone to secure their devices. Officer, please escort Mr. Blackwell to the cruiser." Trent began to shout again, spewing profanities and desperate empty threats, as the younger officer pulled his arms behind his back and secured the heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. The satisfying click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply in the foyer. Trent looked back at Monique one last time, but she was too busy staring in horror at her phone screen watching her follower count begin to drop, and the negative comments multiply by the second. My father slowly looked up from the floor, his eyes hollow and empty. "You planned this from the very beginning," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Trent's struggling. "You waited until we had nothing left, until we were completely exposed to humiliate us." I looked down at the man who had always demanded perfection, but rewarded only deception. "I did not plan your greed, Dad," I replied softly. "I did not plan your desperation for status, or your willingness to trust a con artist over your own flesh and blood. I just bought the debt you willingly accumulated, and now I am calling it in." My mother finally lifted her face, her makeup completely ruined, her eyes swollen and red. She looked around the grand foyer, taking in the shattered vase, the police officers, the handcuffed son-in-law, and the daughter she had always treated like dirt, standing victorious in the center of it all. "What are we supposed to do now, Sloane?" she asked, her voice trembling with genuine fear. "Where are we supposed to go?" I turned my back on them, walking slowly toward the massive front doors, where my estate manager, William, stood waiting with perfect posture. I paused at the threshold, feeling the warm morning sun on my face, breathing in the fresh air of a future that belonged entirely to me. "I suppose you will have to find a cute little apartment complex out in the suburbs," I said, tossing her own words back at her without looking over my shoulder. "I hear they do not require a high credit score, and the rent is strictly baseline. It should be perfectly your speed." I stepped out of the doors and walked down the limestone steps, leaving them all behind in the wreckage of their own lies. The white Mercedes-Benz still sat idling in the circular driveway, a rented prop in a play that had finally been canceled. I did not look back as I walked past it, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The mansion, the firm, the wealth, none of it mattered as much as the absolute, undeniable freedom of knowing I would never have to seek their approval ever again. The family hierarchy had not just been broken, it had been completely dismantled, and I was the one walking away with the only crown that mattered, my own. I was halfway down the limestone steps when the sound of Monique's shrill voice echoing from the open doorway made me pause. The rented white Mercedes-Benz still sat idling in the circular driveway, waiting for an exit I was no longer ready to make. Walking away was the dignified choice, but dignity had never worked with my family. They fed on silence and used it to spin their own narratives, to twist the truth until they were the victims and I was the villain. I could hear Monique pacing in the foyer, her voice pitching higher as she spun a web of frantic lies to her hundreds of thousands of followers. I turned around, my heels crunching against the gravel, and walked back up the wide stone steps. The heavy mahogany doors were still wide open. Inside, the scene was exactly as I had left it, but the energy had shifted into something far more volatile. Chief Harrison and his younger officer were waiting for the transport vehicle to arrive, holding a visibly sweating Trent near the base of the grand staircase. My mother, Vivian, was still weeping into her hands, while my father, Jerome, stared at the eviction notice as if trying to decipher a foreign language. And then there was Monique, holding her phone like a shield, weeping beautifully for her digital audience. "Look at what she is doing to us, guys," Monique sobbed to her screen, ensuring the perfect lighting caught her tears. "My sister has always been deeply disturbed. She is a sociopath who cannot stand to see me happy. Trent is an amazing husband, and she is trying to frame him with fake documents just to steal my dream home. Please share this stream. People need to know how dangerous Sloane really is. She is trying to cancel my life, but I will not let her win. She refused to lose. Even with the police standing right there, even with her husband in handcuffs, she was doubling down on the delusion. She thought her internet army could save her from the cold, hard facts of a federal indictment. I stepped back into the foyer, my presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room except Monique, who was too busy reading the supportive comments flooding her screen. I did not say a word to her. Instead, I bypassed the foyer and walked directly into the massive sunken living room that adjoined the entryway. The room was dominated by a custom-built 100-inch smart television mounted against a slab of imported black marble. I pulled my secure tablet from my leather portfolio and tapped the screen, waking it up. "Sloane, what are you doing?" my father demanded, his voice weak and raspy, finally pulling his eyes away from the forged loan documents. I ignored him, navigating through my secure files. Monique, hearing my father's voice, turned her camera toward me and followed me into the living room. "There she is," Monique narrated to her followers, her voice dripping with venom. "The woman trying to destroy my family." "What are you doing, Sloane? Are you looking for more fake props for your little performance? You are going viral right now, and not in a good way. Everyone is seeing you for the jealous psycho you truly are." I connected my tablet to the mansion's local network. The massive television on the wall chimed softly, and the screen flickered to life. I did not need to speak loudly. The acoustics of the empty room carried my voice perfectly, and Monique's phone was picking up every single word. "You are absolutely right, Monique," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on my tablet. "Transparency is very important. Your followers deserve to know exactly who they are supporting. They deserve to see the real Trenton Blackwell, the Prince Charming you have been bragging about for the last 3 years." With a single swipe of my finger, I sent the first document to the television. It was not a corporate lease agreement or a forged business loan. It was a highly detailed, itemized bank statement from an account Trent had tried very hard to keep hidden offshore. The numbers were massive, displayed in crisp, high definition across the 100-inch screen. Trent let out a strangled gasp from the foyer, struggling against the officer's grip. "Turn that off!" he yelled, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You have no right to access those files. Chief Harrison, make her turn that off right now." Chief Harrison simply crossed his arms, his expression stony. "She is on her own property, Mr. Blackwell," he replied calmly. "And given the nature of your financial crimes, I believe this is highly relevant." Monique stared at the giant screen. Her phone still pointed directly at the evidence. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing its performative edge, replaced by genuine confusion. "These are bank statements. What does this prove, Sloane, that my husband has money?" I swiped to the next page, highlighting a series of massive withdrawals. "These are the funds Trent stole from Mom and Dad's retirement accounts," I explained, my voice echoing through the room. "See this transfer here? $400,000 liquidated from our father's manufacturing company. And this one, $250,000 pulled from an equity line of credit our parents co-signed." My mother let out a sharp cry, covering her mouth with her hands as the reality of her ruined finances was displayed in brutal high definition. But Monique simply shook her head, refusing to process the math. "So what?" she argued defiantly. "He moves money around for investments. He is a financial genius. You are just trying to confuse everyone with numbers." I smiled coldly, tapping the screen of my tablet. "He is not investing, Monique. He is spending. And he is not spending it on you." I swiped again, and the bank statements vanished, replaced by a series of high-resolution photographs. The collective gasp in the room was louder than the police radio crackling in the background. The photos had been obtained by private investigators during the corporate audit of my father's company. They were undeniable, clear, and devastating. The images displayed across the massive wall showed Trent on a sun-drenched balcony in Cabo San Lucas. He was not alone. He was wrapped around a stunning, tall brunette woman, pouring champagne into her glass while she laughed and kissed his cheek. The timestamp on the photo was clearly visible. It was taken exactly 3 months ago during a week when Trent claimed he was in London, closing a vital real estate deal. I swiped to the next photo. Trent and the same brunette woman leaving a high-end jewelry store in Paris, his arm around her waist, a small blue velvet box clutched in his hand. I swiped again. A screenshot of a receipt from that exact jewelry store detailing the purchase of a $120,000 diamond tennis bracelet. A bracelet that Monique definitely did not own. "This is your Prince Charming." "Monique," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the absolute silence of the room. "He is not just a broke fraud who bled our parents dry to lease this fake mansion. He has been funding an entirely separate life with his secret mistress, using the exact same stolen money. While you were bragging to your followers about your perfect wealthy husband, he was draining your parents' life savings to buy diamonds for another woman." Monique's arm slowly lowered, her phone still broadcasting, but the lens now pointed slightly toward the floor, capturing the audio and the ambient light of the television screen. She was completely paralyzed. The carefully constructed facade she had worn her entire life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her eyes were locked on the giant screen, tracing the features of the woman who was living the life she thought belonged to her. Trent was thrashing against the police officers, now his face purple with rage and humiliation. The secret was out. His entire grift was exposed to the world, and there was no spinning this narrative. The evidence was literally larger than life, staring down at everyone in the room. "That is not what it looks like," Trent screamed, his voice desperate and manic. "Monique, baby, listen to me. She is doctoring the photos. She is trying to frame me. I love you. I only love you." Monique slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The internet audience forgotten the desperate need for status replaced by a sudden crushing wave of ultimate betrayal. She had sold her soul, her sister, and her parents' financial future for the illusion of being a wealthy, beloved wife. And the man who had promised her that illusion had humiliated her on a global scale. "Who is she?" Monique whispered, her voice completely devoid of the shrill arrogance that usually defined her. "Who is that woman, Trent?" Trent opened his mouth to lie again, but I simply swiped to the next slide on the television. It was an audio recording extracted from Trent's own voicemail records. I pressed play, and Trent's voice echoed through the massive living room. "Yeah, baby, I know," he said on the recording, his tone smooth and affectionate. "I miss you too. I just have to deal with my stupid wife and her gullible parents for a little while longer. As soon as I can squeeze the last bit of equity out of the old man's company, I am packing my bags and flying back to you. I promise we will be in Aspen by Christmas. Just hang tight." The audio cut off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. My mother. Vivian collapsed onto the nearest sofa, her face buried in her hands, weeping with a raw, guttural sound that spoke of complete despair. She had traded her own daughter for proximity to this man, and he had viewed her as nothing more than a gullible mark to be bled dry. My father Jerome stood perfectly still, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The manufacturing business he had built from scratch, the legacy he had prioritized over his own flesh and blood, had been hollowed out to buy designer trips for a con artist's mistress. The shame of his absolute failure as a businessman and a father was radiating from him in waves. Monique let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She lifted her phone, her hands shaking violently, and pointed it directly at Trent. "Look at him!" she shrieked to her live stream, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Look at this liar! Look at this piece of trash! He ruined my life! He stole from my family! He is a broke, cheating fraud! I want everyone to see his face. Cancel him. Ruin him. Make sure he never shows his face in public again." Trent's eyes widened in sheer terror as he realized the lens was fixed on him. The police officers were holding him firmly, but the panic of being permanently humiliated online gave him a sudden desperate burst of adrenaline. The entitlement that had carried him through life snapped, twisting into violent rage. He could not charm his way out of this, and he could not tolerate the public exposure. "Shut off that phone, you stupid bitch!" Trent roared, lunging forward with all his weight. He caught the younger police officer off guard, breaking free from her grip for a split second. He charged directly at Monique, his hands reaching out like claws to snatch the device from her grasp. Monique screamed, stumbling backward in her high heels, losing her balance as she tried to protect her phone. Trent closed the distance, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure aggression. But before his hands could reach Monique, a sudden blur of motion intercepted him. My father Jerome, letting out a roar of absolute protective fury, threw his entire body weight at his son-in-law. The collision was brutal. Jerome tackled Trent around the waist, driving him away from Monique and sending them both crashing onto the hard marble floor. The impact shook the room. Trent gasped for air as my father's hands closed around his collar. The same man who had worshipped Trent just an hour ago was now pinning him to the floor, his fists raining down in a flurry of uncoordinated but desperate punches. "You stole from me!" Jerome screamed, tears of rage streaming down his aging face. "You destroyed my family, you ruined my company." Absolute chaos erupted. Vivian screamed Jerome's name, jumping up from the sofa. Monique scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, still holding her phone up, broadcasting the violent melee to the entire internet. The two police officers immediately dove into the fray, shouting orders, pulling their tasers, and struggling to drag my father off the thrashing, bleeding con man. I stood quietly near the console table, watching the physical manifestation of their toxic dynamic tear itself apart. The television screen behind them still glowed brightly with the image of Trent's offshore bank statements, a glowing monument to the truth they had refused to see. Chief Harrison blew a sharp blast on his whistle, his voice booming over the shouting. "Enough! Stand down right now or you are both going away in cuffs." The younger officer managed to pull my father back, restraining him against the wall, while Chief Harrison pinned Trent face down on the marble, forcefully clicking the handcuffs tighter. Trent was bleeding from his lip, whining and groaning about police brutality and threatening to sue everyone in the room. My father was panting heavily, clutching his chest as the adrenaline faded, leaving him looking incredibly old and completely broken. Monique slowly lowered her phone, her chest heaving as she surveyed the destruction. Her dream home was a crime scene. Her husband was a bleeding, arrested fraud. Her parents were financially and emotionally ruined, and her live stream had captured every single second of the brutal, undeniable truth. Her thousands of followers had seen the mask fall, had heard the audio, and had witnessed the physical brawl. There was no coming back from this. Her social standing was permanently erased. I smoothly disconnected my tablet from the network, and the giant television screen went black, plunging the room back into natural sunlight. I slid the tablet back into my leather portfolio, securing the clasp with a soft metallic click. I looked at the four of them one last time, taking in the absolute ruins of the Carmichael family hierarchy. They were a mess of shattered illusions and consequences they could no longer outrun. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that I was a failure because I did not fit into their shallow, desperate mold. But the truth had finally leveled the playing field, and I was the only one left standing. Chief Harrison looked up from where he was holding Trent, his expression grim but respectful. "We have it from here, Mrs. Carmichael," he said quietly. "I apologize that your property had to be the scene of this disturbance. We will have this area cleared shortly." "Thank you, Chief," I replied, my voice steady and completely unbothered. "Please let my legal team know if you require any additional documentation regarding the fraud investigation. My firm is fully prepared to cooperate with the federal authorities." I turned my back on the wreckage and walked out of the living room, crossing the grand foyer toward the massive open doors. I did not look at my mother, who was still weeping softly by the wall. I did not look at my father, who was staring blankly at his own shaking hands. And I certainly did not look at Monique, who was staring at her phone screen, watching the endless flood of shocked comments roll in. I stepped out onto the limestone porch, breathing in the warm morning air. The rented white Mercedes still sat in the driveway, a pathetic reminder of the life they had tried to fake. I walked past it, making my way down the long, sweeping driveway toward the main gates. The heavy burden of their expectations, the constant sting of their rejection, the lifelong need to prove my worth, it was all gone. I had burned their toxic kingdom to the ground and walked out without a single scratch. I opened the door to my own waiting vehicle, sliding into the quiet, luxurious interior. I told the driver to head back to the office. I had a private equity firm to run and a beautiful empire to build. Alone. Completely and entirely free. I settled into the buttery leather seat of my car, the heavy door closing with a solid, reassuring thud that shut out the screaming from the foyer. My driver started the engine, the quiet hum of the luxury vehicle vibrating beneath me, but we did not move. The circular driveway was a chaotic mess of local police cruisers, and I was in no rush. I opened my tablet again, tapping the screen to bring up Monique's live stream. I wanted to watch the final act of the play I had just directed. The camera angle was wildly skewed, pointing upward from where it had fallen on the marble floor near the console table, but the audio was crystal clear, and the wide-angle lens captured the entire disastrous scene. Chief Harrison had Trent pinned against the grand staircase, his hands securely cuffed behind his back. Blood was dripping from Trent's split lip, staining his ruined cashmere sweater. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of his arrogant Wall Street facade, leaving nothing but a terrified, cornered animal. "You cannot put all this on me!" Trent was screaming, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. A desperate, panicked shriek that made the audio on my tablet clip. "I am not taking the fall for all of it. You need to arrest her too." He jerked his head toward Monique, who was still slumped against the wall, staring in horror at her dropped phone. "Shut up, Trent!" Monique shrieked, her voice trembling with hysteria. "You lied to me. You told me you were rich. You told me the money was from your trust fund." Rich Trent laughed, a harsh barking sound that bordered on madness. "You knew exactly how broke we were, Monique. You knew it 6 months into the marriage when my black card started declining and the bank threatened to repossess my car. Do not play the innocent victim for the internet. You are just as guilty as I am. You pushed me to do this." The live comment stream on my tablet was moving so fast, it was just a blur of white text. Thousands of people were watching the ultimate influencer fairy tale implode in real time. Followers who used to praise her outfits were now calling the police department, asking for her to be arrested. Trent lunged forward, slightly restrained by the police chief, his eyes bulging with manic desperation. "You forced me to steal from your parents," he yelled, spitting blood onto the pristine floor. "You told me you would divorce me and humiliate me publicly if I did not maintain your lifestyle. You think those Hermes bags you show off online are real. They are fake. Every single designer piece you bought in the last 2 years was funded by the money I siphoned from your idiotic father's manufacturing company. You sat there and handed me their financial documents and told me to figure it out so you could keep playing rich for your followers. You told me to drain their accounts because they would never notice." The accusation hit the room like a bomb. My father Jerome, who was sitting on the edge of the sofa catching his breath, slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and wide with a new terrifying realization. He looked from the handcuffed con artist to his golden child daughter. "Monique," he whispered, his voice breaking, cracking under the weight of a betrayal far worse than anything Trent had done. "You knew. You knew he was stealing my retirement funds, and you helped him do it just to buy fake handbags. You stole from your own father." Monique scrambled away from the wall, her hands raised defensively. "No, Dad!" she cried, shaking her head so violently, her hair whipped around her face. "No, he is lying. He is trying to drag me down with him. I did not know he was taking it from you, I swear." But her eyes betrayed her. The panic in her expression was not the panic of an innocent woman falsely accused. It was the raw, naked terror of someone whose deepest, darkest secret had just been dragged into the light. She looked at my father and saw the absolute disgust radiating from him. She looked at the phone on the floor, knowing her entire digital empire was burning to ash. And then, with her back against the wall, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She blamed someone else. She spun around and pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my mother. Vivian was still weeping, clutching a decorative pillow to her chest. But Monique's scream made her flinch. "This is your fault," Monique shrieked, her voice tearing through the room like shattered glass. "You did this to me, Mom. You pushed me into this." Vivian gasped, her hands dropping to her lap. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her perfectly maintained socialite mask completely dissolving into a puddle of confusion and despair. "How is this my fault? I gave you everything. I supported your marriage. I gave you the wedding of your dreams. You told me to marry a wealthy white man at all costs," Monique screamed, the toxic truth of their respectability. Politics finally bursting out of her chest. "You hammered it into my head since I was a little girl. You dragged me to those country clubs. You made me drop my black friends so I could network with the white elite. You told me that proximity to whiteness and old money was the only way this family would ever truly be accepted by high society. You told me to ignore the red flags. You told me that even if Trent was struggling, his last name alone was worth the investment." Vivian shrank back into the sofa, shaking her head in denial. "No," she whimpered. "I only wanted what was best for you. I wanted you to be secure." "You wanted a trophy?" Monique fired back, stepping closer to our mother, her face twisted with a lifetime of inherited self-hatred. "You wanted a white son-in-law you could parade around the country club to make your racist friends jealous. When I told you Trent was having liquidity issues last year, you told me to keep my mouth shut, smile for the cameras and do whatever it takes to keep the marriage intact, because a divorce would ruin our family brand. You practically begged him to manage Dad's money so you could brag about it at your charity luncheons. You fed us to him, Mom. You fed Dad to him just so you could feel like you belonged." Jerome let out a guttural sound of pure agony. He stared at his wife, the woman he had built his entire life around, the woman whose social ambitions had just cost him his company, his retirement, and his dignity. "You knew he was broke, Vivian," my father asked, his voice deadly quiet, a stark contrast to the screaming that had dominated the morning. "You pushed our daughter to stay with a fraud to protect your image." I watched my mother try to speak to defend herself, but there was no defense left. The ugly, rotten core of their family dynamic was laid completely bare. They had worshipped at the altar of aesthetic success and racial validation, and it had cost them absolutely everything. They had sacrificed their own daughter, their own financial security, and their own morality just to play a role in a society that never truly cared about them anyway. They were dogs, biting dogs, tearing each other apart to protect an illusion that had never been real. Trent let out another bitter laugh from the staircase. "You are all pathetic," he sneered, spitting blood again. "You deserve each other. Every single one of you is just as fake as the life you pretend to live. Jerome, you spent your whole life trying to buy your way into rooms where everyone laughed at you behind your back. Vivian, you sold out your own blood for a country club membership. And Monique, you are just a hollow shell doing tricks for internet strangers." Chief Harrison yanked Trent's arms upward, forcing a sharp gasp of pain from the con man. "All right, keep your mouth shut, Mr. Blackwell," he ordered sternly. "We are leaving. Officer, get him out the door, read him his rights, and put him in the back of the cruiser. We have enough evidence here to lock him away for a very long time." The younger officer grabbed Trent's shoulder, pulling him roughly toward the open front doors. Trent stumbled, his expensive shoes slipping on the marble floor. Monique collapsed onto her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, entirely ignored by her parents, who were now locked in a silent, devastating stare-down of mutual destruction. The family was dead. The business was gone. The wealth was a mirage. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice, and I had front-row seats. I tapped the screen of my tablet, closing the live stream. I had seen enough. The emotional closure I had been seeking for 30 years was finally mine. I looked up to the front of my car, tapping the glass partition separating me from my driver. "We can go now, William. I said, my voice calm and steady. Take me back to the office. Yes, Mrs. Carmichael William replied, putting the car into gear. But as the heavy luxury vehicle began to slowly roll forward, the quiet morning air was suddenly ripped apart by a new sound. It was not the steady rhythmic wail of local police cruisers. This siren was deeper, louder, and far more aggressive. The sound bounced off the manicured trees and the stone walls of the estate, creating a deafening roar that made my driver hit the brakes. I frowned, looking out the tinted window as a fleet of unmarked heavy black SUVs came tearing up the private road leading to the estate. They moved with tactical precision, swerving aggressively around the parked local police cars and completely blocking the circular driveway. There were at least 6 of them, their tires squealing as they slammed to a halt directly in front of the mansion's grand entrance, trapping my car in the process. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. Over a dozen men and women wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers poured out. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs were unmistakable. FBI. I rolled down my window slightly, the cool air rushing in, carrying the sounds of the escalating chaos. Chief Harrison and his officer had just dragged Trent out onto the limestone porch when the federal agents swarmed the steps. Their weapons were drawn, their expressions locked into absolute professional severity. "Trenton Blackwell!" a tall, stern-looking federal agent shouted, holding up a thick stack of paperwork. He flashed a badge at the local police chief before turning his hard gaze entirely onto my brother-in-law. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a federal warrant for your immediate apprehension on multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate racketeering." Trent's face, drained of whatever color it had, left his knees, literally buckling beneath him. The local police officer had to hold him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing completely onto the stone steps. The word federal hung in the air like an executioner's axe. He knew what that meant. There were no plea deals to sweep this under the rug. There were no country club friends to bail him out. Federal meant federal prison. Federal agents began pushing past them, swarming into the grand foyer of the mansion. "Secure the premises," the lead agent barked into a radio on his shoulder. "Seize all electronic devices, financial records, and physical assets. Everything inside is subject to federal asset forfeiture. Lock down the property. Nobody leaves." I saw agents rushing into the living room, grabbing Monique's phone off the floor, terminating the live stream for good. I watched them march upstairs toward the master bedroom, ready to bag up all those fake Hermes purses and stolen jewelry. They were tearing the house apart methodically and relentlessly, seizing every single item that had been purchased with my father's stolen money. My mother and father were dragged out onto the porch by federal agents, their faces blank with shock as they were ordered to sit on the stone steps alongside their weeping golden child daughter. They were not under arrest yet, but they were being detained for questioning regarding their involvement in the fraudulent loans. The absolute humiliation of sitting on the front porch of a mansion they did not own, surrounded by federal agents while the neighbors watched from their windows, was the final nail in the coffin. I sat in the back of my car watching the federal raid unfold with a mixture of dark amusement and cold satisfaction. Trent had not just stolen from my parents, he had clearly crossed lines that attracted the attention of the highest law enforcement agencies in the country. My forensic accounting team must have forwarded their findings to the Justice Department the moment I gave the green light. The dogs were not just biting each other anymore. They were being rounded up and hauled off to the pound. William looked back at me through the partition, his eyes wide. "It seems we are blocked in, Mrs. Carmichael," he said, stating the obvious. The federal vehicles were parked bumper to bumper, making it impossible for us to maneuver out of the driveway. I leaned back into the comfortable leather seats, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the absolute ruins of the Carmichael family hierarchy. I reached over and poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the car's built-in cooler, taking a slow, refreshing sip. "That is quite all right, William," I replied, a small, genuine smile finally touching my lips. "I am in no rush. Let us sit here and watch the rest of the show. I sat in the quiet luxury of my car, watching the final pathetic moments of Trent's freedom unfold through the tinted glass. The federal agents did not treat him with the gentle deference he had always expected from the world. They shoved him forward, his arms twisted awkwardly behind his back, the heavy metal handcuffs biting into his wrists. His expensive loafers dragged across the pristine gravel of the circular driveway, scuffing the leather he was so proud of. The lead agent pressed a heavy hand down on the back of Trent's neck, forcing him to bend over as they pushed him into the cramped back seat of the black federal SUV. The heavy door slammed shut with a hollow, echoing thud that sounded like a vault sealing shut forever. There was no bail for what he had done. There was no talking his way out of federal wire fraud and corporate racketeering. The Prince Charming of the Carmichael family was going to a concrete cell. Inside the mansion, the federal raid was in full swing. I could see agents moving past the massive windows, boxing up every piece of designer clothing, every piece of jewelry, every single item funded by the money Trent had siphoned from my father's life work. Monique was still inside somewhere, likely screaming and crying as agents stripped her of the only things that gave her hollow life any meaning. She was losing her aesthetic, her brand, her followers, and her freedom all at once. The absolute destruction of her fake reality was complete. But it was the sight on the front steps that finally drew me out of the car. My parents were left standing on the limestone porch, completely ignored by the tactical team swarming the property. The local police had finished detaining them for initial questioning and had simply left them there. They looked like two empty, hollow shells of the proud, arrogant people they had been just an hour ago. I pushed open the heavy door of my vehicle and stepped out into the warm morning air. The gravel crunched softly under my heels as I walked toward the massive front steps of the estate that I owned. My father, Jerome, did not even look up as I approached. He sat heavily on the stone stairs, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging down in absolute defeat. The great chairman of Carmichael Industries was entirely broken. He was staring at his shaking hands as the finality of his ruin settled over him. He had signed away controlling interest of his company. He had allowed his entire retirement portfolio to be drained into offshore accounts. And worst of all, he had lost the massive colonial home in the suburbs where I had grown up. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their personal estate last week when the fraudulent second mortgage Trent convinced them to take out went into default. My parents were effectively and entirely homeless. They had spent their whole lives building a fortress of respectability, politics trying to buy their way into elite white society to escape the reality of who they were. And they had let a mediocre con artist steal every single penny they had simply because he fit their aesthetic ideal of success. They traded their actual blood, their actual daughter for a toxic illusion, and now they had to live in the ashes. Jerome could not even meet my eyes. His ego was crushed under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. But my mother Vivian saw me walking toward them. The desperation in her eyes was raw and toxic. All of her country club arrogance, all of her carefully curated socialite pride completely evaporated in the face of her impending poverty. She saw the tailored suit I was wearing. She saw the luxury car waiting for me, and she saw the estate that I now controlled. Her survival instinct kicked in, overriding whatever shame she should have felt. She scrambled down the limestone steps, her expensive dress dragging against the rough stone. She did not just walk toward me. She threw herself forward, her knees hitting the sharp gravel as she practically crawled to where I was standing. She reached out her trembling hands, grasping blindly at the fabric of my trousers. "Sloan," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a pathetic, whining desperation that made my skin crawl. "Sloan, please, you have to help us." I looked down at her, completely repulsed by the sight of the woman who had birthed me groveling in the dirt. I did not step back, but I did not reach out to comfort her either. I simply stood there, letting her feel the cold, hard reality of the power dynamic she had created. "We have absolutely nothing left," Vivian wailed, tears streaming down her face. ruining her perfect makeup and leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. The bank took our house loan. Trent took all of our money. The company is gone. We have nowhere to go. Her fingers tightened on my clothes, her knuckles white with panic. Please, Sloane. You are my daughter, she begged, her voice pitching higher. Playing the ultimate card she thought she still held. I am so sorry for everything. I was wrong about Trent. I was wrong about Monique. But I always knew you were the smart one. I always knew you would be the one to succeed and build something amazing. You have so much money now. You own this entire estate. Please let us stay here. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. She knelt there in the gravel, rewriting history in real time, trying to convince me that she had always believed in me. This was the same woman who had called me a failure, the same woman who had mocked my business degree, the same woman who had told me I would never be as beautiful or as successful as Monique. And now that her chosen golden child had destroyed their lives, she wanted to play the loving, supportive mother. She wanted to hide in my mansion and reap the benefits of the very success she had tried so incredibly hard to sabotage. We will be quiet, she continued to beg, sobbing so hard she was practically choking on her own tears. We will take one of the guest rooms in the back. You will not even know we are here. We will do whatever you want, Sloane. Just please do not leave us on the street. You cannot let your own parents be homeless. You have to save us. I stared down into her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely no pity, no obligation, and no lingering sense of familial duty. The last remaining tether holding me to these toxic people had been severed the moment they walked into this foyer and demanded I pay off Trent's debts. They did not love me. They only loved what my money could do for them. I slowly reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out my phone. The smooth metal felt cool against my palm. I unlocked the screen, tapping the keypad to dial a number, holding the device loosely in my hand as I looked down at the pathetic woman weeping at my feet. "Let you stay here?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that completely cut through the sound of her frantic sobbing. Vivian nodded desperately, a spark of pathetic hope lighting up in her swollen eyes. "Yes, please, Sloane," she whimpered. I tilted my head slightly, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips as I looked from my mother crawling in the gravel to my father staring blankly at the stone steps. "Did you forget the night you kicked me out in the snow when I was 18? Vivian froze her mouth, opening and closing wordlessly as the memory of that bitter January night hung in the air between us. She remembered. I could see it in the sudden, terrified flinching of her eyes. Her hand slowly fell away from the hem of my tailored trousers, dropping into the cold marble dust of the shattered porcelain. I was 18 years old, holding a plastic trash bag full of my clothes, standing on the front porch of your suburban house while the snow piled up around my bare ankles. I said, my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the satisfaction of my anger. "You told me that I was a disruption to your perfect household. You told me that because I refused to major in the degree you chose for me, because I refused to mold myself into the acceptable little prop you wanted. I was no longer welcome under your roof." Jerome stood right behind you, holding a glass of scotch, watching his youngest daughter freeze, and he did not say a single word. He just sipped his drink and locked the deadbolt. My father flinched at the sound of his name, but he still did not look up. He was staring at the floor, a completely defeated man, crushed beneath the weight of his own monumental arrogance. "You told me that family was conditional on obedience." I continued, pacing slowly around them. "You taught me that love was a transaction, so I learned how to transact." I reached into my leather portfolio one final time. I did not pull out a corporate takeover document or a federal indictment. I pulled out 3 thick, meticulously bound folders and dropped them onto the marble table. The heavy thud echoed like a final judgment in the grand foyer. "What is that?" Monique asked. Her voice a hollow, raspy croak. She was leaning against the wall, looking like a broken doll, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "These are itemized invoices," I explained, tapping my manicured nail against the thickest folder. I have spent the last 5 years paying a team of private investigators and forensic accountants to document every single thing you took from me. Every ounce of energy, every stolen opportunity, and every financial burden you forced me to carry while you paraded Monique around like a show pony and threw money at a man who was actively robbing you blind. I opened the first folder, spreading the printed spreadsheets across the table. This is the college tuition you promised to pay, and then suddenly revoked the day before my freshman semester began. You lied to the financial aid office, claiming I was fully supported, forcing me to take out predatory student loans with massive interest rates just to keep my dorm room. I worked 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night to pay off the debt you intentionally strapped to my back, while you bought Monique a brand new convertible for getting a C average in communications. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, crying harder. "Sloan, please stop," she whimpered. "We were just trying to teach you independence. We wanted you to be strong." I ignored her pathetic excuse and opened the second folder. These are the medical bills from when I was hospitalized with severe pneumonia at 21. I called you from the emergency room begging for a small loan just to cover my insurance copay so I could afford my antibiotics. You told me to be an adult and figure it out because you needed the liquid cash for Monique's extravagant engagement party. You let me drown in medical debt, coughing up blood in a cheap studio apartment so you could buy imported white roses and ice sculptures to impress people who do not even like you. I slapped my hand flat against the third and final folder, the sound cracking like a whip. "And this is the total sum of the trust fund that Grandma left specifically for me. The account you managed to legally siphon away through a loophole in the custodial paperwork to pay for your country club dues, your luxury car leases, and the down payment on Monique's first fake house. You stole my foundation to fund your facade. You literally robbed your own child to buy proximity to wealthy white people who laughed at you behind your backs." I looked at the 3 of them shivering in their expensive clothes, completely stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their illusions. "There is no family here." I said the words, tasting like absolute beautiful freedom on my tongue. "We just share DNA, and as of today, that transaction is permanently closed." Vivian shook her head violently, her hands grabbing at her own hair. "Sloan, please," she begged, her voice deteriorating into a pathetic animalistic whine. "You cannot just throw us away like trash. We have nowhere to go. The bank took the house. Trent took the money. The business is gone. We are your parents. You owe us some basic respect." I looked past her to my estate manager, William, who had silently stepped back into the foyer, accompanied by 2 broad-shouldered security guards in dark, tailored suits. "William," I said smoothly without breaking eye contact with the weeping woman at my feet, "please prepare to escort these trespassers off my property." Vivian sobbed harder, desperately lunging forward to grab my legs again. "You are leaving us with nothing," she wailed, her face completely distorted with panic. "How will we eat, Sloan? How will we get a hotel room? We do not even have a car. You cannot put us out on the street." I stepped back effortlessly, pulling my legs free from her desperate grasp. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my slim leather wallet. I opened it and extracted 2 crisp $100 bills, holding them up between my fingers. The silence in the room was absolute as everyone watched the money. I let the bills slip from my fingers, watching them flutter down through the pristine air of the grand foyer, landing perfectly in the center of Vivian's lap. "I am giving you exactly what you gave me that night in the snow," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any pity. $200. You handed me 2 crumpled bills and told me I was mature for my age and that I would figure it out. Well, Vivian, you are 62 years old. I am sure you will figure it out. The finality of the moment hung heavy and absolute. The 2 security guards stepped forward, moving with swift professional efficiency. One of them grasped Vivian by her upper arms, pulling her up from the marble floor despite her thrashing and wailing. The other guard placed a firm hand on Jerome's shoulder. My father did not resist. He did not speak. He did not even look at the $200 in his wife's hand. He moved like a ghost, a man entirely hollowed out by his own arrogance, shuffling toward the door on trembling legs. Monique was still clutching her dead smartphone, her face a mask of ruined makeup and shattered ego. She stumbled toward the exit, her expensive high heels clicking unevenly against the floor. She looked around the mansion one last time, mourning the crystal chandeliers, the sweeping staircases, and the imported marble. She was not mourning her family or her marriage. She was mourning the aesthetic. As if the universe itself was demanding a highly cinematic exit, the sky outside had darkened considerably during the chaos. The warm, bright morning sunshine was entirely gone, replaced by thick, bruised purple clouds rolling in from the coast. A sudden torrential downpour began to lash against the towering windows of the mansion. The rain fell in heavy, angry sheets, pounding the gravel driveway and instantly flooding the perfectly manicured flower beds lining the front steps. The security guards marched them out the massive front doors and pushed them firmly out into the brutal storm. I stood comfortably on the covered limestone porch, my arms crossed over my chest, watching the scene unfold. The water instantly soaked into Vivian's expensive silk dress, plastering the fabric to her skin and completely washing away the last remnants of her high society illusion. Jerome's tailored suit clung to his slumping frame as he shivered violently in the sudden cold rain, his shoulders hunched against the downpour. Monique wailed loudly, a sharp, ugly sound as the rain hit her. She tried desperately to lift her designer handbag over her head to shield her hair, but the heavy, aggressive drops completely saturated the expensive leather, ruining it in seconds. Their rented white Mercedes had already been towed away by the authorities, per the federal asset forfeiture protocol. They had absolutely no shelter and no transportation. They had to walk the entire half-mile length of my private driveway on foot. I stood on the dry, pristine porch, watching them trudge through the mud and the rushing water. Their grand legacy, their desperate lifelong pursuit of elite status, reduced to wet clothes, ruined shoes, and a $200 handout. The sheer poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. They were finally experiencing the exact same helpless, freezing abandonment they had forced upon me all those years ago. I watched them slip and stumble, their figures growing smaller as they made their way down the long, winding driveway toward the massive wrought iron security gates at the edge of the property. The rain was so loud it drowned out the sound of my mother's crying, leaving nothing but the rhythmic pounding of the storm. But just as they reached the heavy iron gates, shivering and completely drenched, the sound of a powerful engine cut sharply through the noise of the pouring rain. A sleek midnight black Maybach with heavily tinted windows pulled up smoothly from the main road, blocking their path out of the estate. The heavy rain beaded perfectly off the pristine ceramic paint job as the massive luxury vehicle idled in the storm. The rear passenger window began to roll down with a soft mechanical hum, revealing the dark interior. The face that emerged from the shadows of the Maybach was one my parents did not recognize, but it was a face that had defined my entire professional life. Marcus Sterling, the founder of the venture capital firm that had backed my very first independent project, looked out at the three soaking wet figures shivering in the mud. He did not look at them with pity or anger, but with the absolute cold indifference of a man who only dealt in high-value assets. To Marcus, my parents and my sister were completely bankrupt. His driver stepped out first, opening a massive black umbrella to shield Marcus from the driving rain as he emerged from the luxury vehicle. My father, Jerome, tried to step forward, his wetsuit clinging to his shaking frame, raising a hand as if to ask for help or a ride, or perhaps just to seek the familiar comfort of another wealthy man. But Marcus did not even break his stride. He walked right past them, his expensive leather shoes stepping precisely over the puddles, ignoring my father's outstretched hand and Monique's hysterical sobbing, as if they were nothing more than debris blown into the driveway by the storm. Marcus made his way up the long, sweeping path toward the porch where I was waiting. The security guard stepped aside to let him pass. He reached the top of the limestone steps, and the driver closed the umbrella. Marcus looked at me, then turned slowly to look back down the driveway at the three pathetic figures finally stumbling around his idling Maybach to continue their walk of shame out the heavy iron gates. "You always said you had a pest problem at this property, Sloane." Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through the sound of the rain. I am glad to see you finally called the exterminators. I smiled, stepping forward to shake his hand. The federal agents were very thorough, I replied. The house is clean now. Marcus nodded his eyes, reflecting genuine pride. I watched the news breaking on the drive over. Corporate fraud, money laundering, and the complete collapse of Carmichael Industries. It is a brutal market out there for people who do not read the fine print. You played a masterful game, Sloan. You built an empire while they were busy playing house. We walked through the grand double doors together, leaving the storm and the ruins of my biological family behind us. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the rain and the pathetic wailing of my sister. Inside, the mansion was perfectly quiet. The federal agents had finished their raid, bagging up every piece of evidence, every stolen luxury good, and taking the chaos with them. The house felt completely different now. The oppressive, toxic energy that had choked these halls for decades was entirely gone. It was no longer a monument to my parents' desperate social climbing. It was simply stone glass and space waiting to be filled with something real. That evening, the grand dining room did not host a country club luncheon or a performative family dinner. Instead, the massive mahogany table was set for the people who actually mattered. My forensic accountant, Elias, who had spent months untangling Trent's offshore accounts, sat across from Marcus. My lead legal counsel and my closest friend, Chloe, who had let me sleep on her couch when I was 18 and homeless, was pouring wine. My private security team sat at the far end, eating and laughing with the rest of us. There were no strained conversations about high society gossip. There were no passive-aggressive comments about my appearance or my career choices. The room was filled with the sound of genuine laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the warm, easy energy of people who respected each other. We ate a meal of seared duck and truffle risotto, prepared by a private chef, drinking wine that cost more than the $200 I had tossed into my mother's lap. I sat at the head of the table, looking down at the faces of my true family. These were the people who had invested in me when I had nothing. They had not cared about my last name or my aesthetic. They had seen my drive, my intellect, and my loyalty, and they had matched it. They were my safety net and my foundation. Raising a glass, I offered a simple toast to the empire we built, and the dead weight we finally cut loose. They raised their glasses in unison, the rich red wine catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. I had never felt so entirely at peace. My childhood home was finally mine, and the ghosts that haunted it had been permanently evicted. The night ended with warm embraces and promises to meet at the office on Monday to finalize the acquisition of the remaining Carmichael Industry assets. I walked upstairs to the master suite, a room I had never been allowed to enter as a child. The massive bed was covered in fresh white linens. The walls were stripped of Vivian's gaudy paintings, leaving clean blank spaces. I slept deeply without a single nightmare, the sound of the ocean storm outside lulling me into absolute tranquility. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting bright, clean light across the hardwood floors. I woke up slowly, stretching in the quiet luxury of my new reality. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, making myself a cup of dark roast coffee, and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the pristine grounds. The gravel driveway was empty. The storm had washed away the tire tracks, the footprints, and any lingering trace of the people who used to live here. I was taking my first sip of coffee when my secure mobile phone began to vibrate on the marble counter. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I set my mug down and answered, pressing the phone to my ear. "Is this Sloan Carmichael?" a raspy, exhausted male voice asked. "This is she," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," the voice said. "I am the defense attorney representing Trenton Blackwell." I leaned against the counter, staring out at the bright green lawn. "What can I do for you, Mr. Pendleton? I was under the impression the federal prosecutors had an airtight case against your client." "They do," Mr. Pendleton admitted, a heavy sigh coming through the speaker. "He is facing 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary for the wire fraud alone." They have him dead to rights on the offshore accounts and the falsified loan documents. He has absolutely no leverage, and the judge denied bail because he is a massive flight risk. That sounds like a personal problem for Trent, I said, taking another sip of my coffee. I am not sure why you are calling me. I am calling because Trent is desperate, Mr. Pendleton said, his voice dropping lower. He knows he is going away for a long time, but he wants to make a deal with you. He says he has something else, something the FBI did not find in the raid yesterday. He says it is something that belongs to you, and he is willing to hand it over if you talk to the federal prosecutor and ask for leniency. I stood perfectly still, the coffee mug warming my hands. Trent had nothing left to bargain with. He was a cornered rat, entirely out of options. But the sheer panic in his lawyer's voice told me this was not just another empty bluff. He says he hid it before the raid. Mr. Pendleton continued, sounding almost pleading. He says it is the only thing your father truly cared about, and he will only give you the exact location if you agree to help him. Please, Mrs. Carmichael. He is begging for mercy. I looked out at the heavy iron gates at the end of the driveway, remembering the sight of my family walking out into the freezing rain. They had begged for mercy too. What exactly does he claim to have? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. The lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. He says he has the original trust documents, the ones your grandmother signed before your parents altered them. The silence stretched over the phone line as Pendleton's words settled into my mind. The original trust documents. The ultimate proof of my parents' financial treason against their own daughter, long before Trent even existed. I looked out at the rolling gray waves of the ocean, feeling a slow, deep satisfaction spread through my chest. I told Pendleton to have his client hand over the exact location of the documents and the routing numbers to the hidden offshore account attached to it. The lawyer hesitated, asking for a guarantee in writing that I would secure leniency from the federal prosecutor. I told him my legal team would ensure Trent received exactly what he deserved. It was a carefully worded statement, a completely hollow promise, but a desperate man drowning in a federal holding cell will grab onto a razor blade if he thinks it is a lifeline. Within the hour, Pendleton emailed my team a digital map to a private lockbox facility in Geneva, along with the access codes. My forensic accountants moved with absolute surgical precision. They did not just find the physical documents proving the fraud. They found a hidden cache of over $8 million that Trent had been quietly bleeding from Carmichael Industries long before the real estate crash. It was his escape fund, his ultimate golden parachute meant to fund a new life with his mistress. But with the original trust documents proving the initial capital was legally mine, I had full authorization to seize the account before his lawyers could even blink. I did not keep a single dime of it for myself. My empire was already built on my own sweat and blood, and I did not want their tainted money touching my accounts. Instead, I transferred the entire $8 million to a national foundation dedicated to providing housing and legal support for emotionally abused youth. I named the permanent grant after my grandmother, ensuring that her legacy would be used to save children from the exact kind of toxic family dynamic my parents had trapped me in. As for Trent, I simply forwarded his full confession, the location of his offshore accounts, and the evidence of his attempted bribery directly to the lead FBI investigator. The federal prosecutor was absolutely thrilled to add the new charges. Trent received a sentence of 25 years in a maximum security facility without the possibility of parole. He begged for mercy, and I gave him the exact amount of mercy he had shown my family. 1 year later, the dust had completely settled over the ruins of my former family. The Carmichael name, which my mother had so desperately tried to elevate into high society, had become a cautionary tale whispered at country club dinners. Monique did not survive the fallout of her public humiliation. The internet is a vicious place, and her followers abandoned her the moment the livestream exposed her as a broke fraud. With no money, no husband, and absolutely no brand deals left, she was forced to enter the real world to survive. My private investigator sent me a final report just to close the file. Monique was working as a cashier at a discount retail store on the outskirts of the city. She wore an unflattering polyester uniform, her perfectly manicured nails chipped and ruined from scanning barcodes all day. The report detailed how former high school classmates would sometimes come into the store just to film her taking pictures of the fallen influencer bagging cheap plastic goods. She spent her days hiding her face from the cameras, trapped in a minimum wage purgatory entirely of her own making. She used to show off fake designer bags, and now she was forced to ask people if they wanted paper or plastic. Jerome and Vivian fared even worse. The federal government seized all their remaining assets to pay back the creditors Trent had defrauded, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. They lived in a cramped, low-income one-bedroom apartment located directly above a noisy intersection in a neighborhood they used to mock. There were no imported marble floors or crystal chandeliers, just peeling linoleum-stained walls and the constant smell of cheap cooking oil from the diner downstairs. Vivian spent her days staring blankly at a small television, mourning the country club friends who had immediately blocked her number the day the FBI raided the mansion. Jerome rarely spoke. He sat by the window all day watching the heavy traffic, a broken old man who had traded his entire legacy for the illusion of status. They were forced to take the bus to the grocery store, standing in line with food stamps while their former peers drove past in luxury vehicles. They were trapped together in that tiny, suffocating space with nothing but their mutual resentment and the crushing weight of their choices. They had built a fortress of lies, and now they were serving a life sentence in its rubble. I did not feel any sorrow for them. I did not feel any lingering anger or need to gloat. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of the top floor of a downtown skyscraper I had just acquired for my firm. The night air was cool and crisp against my skin, and the city lights stretched out endlessly below me, like a sea of diamonds. My phone buzzed in my pocket with messages from my team congratulating me on the acquisition, but I took a moment just to breathe in the absolute quiet of my own success. For 30 years, I had fought a silent war against the people who were supposed to protect me. I had let their voices dictate my worth, letting their toxic expectations make me feel small and unlovable. But looking out over the glowing city, I finally understood the profound truth about healing and closure. The sweetest revenge was not the day I kicked them out of my mansion. It was not the day Trent went to prison or the day my mother begged in the gravel. The sweetest revenge was the absolute monumental scale of my success. I had built a life so massive, so beautiful, and so entirely authentic that the people who hurt me simply ceased to exist in my world. They were faded ghosts trapped in a miserable past, while I was standing at the very top of the future, looking forward completely and irrevocably free. The greatest lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by the people who fail to see it. Sometimes the family you are born into will try to keep you small to protect their own fragile egos. But blood does not demand endless loyalty when it comes with a price tag of abuse and manipulation. True strength lies in having the courage to walk away from toxic environments and build a life completely on your own terms. Your ultimate revenge is simply finding genuine happiness and monumental success without them. Please like and subscribe for more stories.